In every city where power is the only currency that matters, the men at the top believe they have already seen everything worth fearing. They have spent years cataloging the faces of rivals, memorizing the particular timbre of every threat, reducing the rest of the world to furniture, background noise, irrelevant mass, objects to be moved around or stepped over or dismissed with the minimum expenditure of attention. That certainty, earned over decades of survival, is always the beginning of the end. Because the most dangerous thing in any room is never the thing you are watching. It is the thing you already decided, in the first 3 seconds, was beneath your notice. The thing you filed away as harmless and stopped tracking. Because the mind that stopped tracking it had already, somewhere in the deep machinery of its arrogance, concluded that it did not need to. Dante Ferrara had built his empire on the premise that he noticed everything. He had made it a point of private pride, the way a surgeon makes clean hands a matter of principle, the way a locksmith makes a silent entry a point of professional honor. He had walked into rooms and cataloged them in the time it took other men to find a chair, had read faces and postures and micro-adjustments of body language the way a musician reads a score, had survived 43 years in an industry where the men who stopped paying attention eventually stopped breathing, and he was still here. Still the most feared name operating in the South Quarter, and considerably beyond it. He was a man who, by his own private reckoning, made wrong assessments almost never. He walked into a butcher shop on the corner of Via Moretti and 9th on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when fog had swallowed the city so completely that the street lamps outside were reduced to faint smears of orange in the gray, looked at the woman behind the counter, made his assessment in under 3 seconds, and decided she was furniture. It was the single greatest error of his professional career. By the time he understood the magnitude of that error, his best man was lying flat on the tile floor, and the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant was the one who had put him there. And Dante Ferrara would spend the remainder of that week and a considerable portion of the one that followed thinking about angles. Kora Bellini had been running her family's butcher shop for 11 years. She had taken it over at 22, in the middle of an inventory count, on the morning her father collapsed between the hanging pork shoulders and the door to the walk-in refrigerator and did not get up again. The paramedics came and took him, and she finished the inventory, because the delivery was due at 4:30 in the morning, and someone needed to be standing at the back door to receive it, log it, verify the weights against the delivery slip, and refuse anything that arrived at the wrong temperature. She had learned everything that followed in the same way. Because it had to be learned, because there was no one else, because the shop did not stop needing to be run, simply because the person running it was also in the middle of a grief she did not have time to properly attend to. She had learned the muscle memory of the cleaver, the particular angle of the shoulder, and the transfer of hip weight that made the difference between a clean cut and a torn one. The bone saw, the slicer, the cold science of refrigeration and the warmer science of selling, of building repeat customers out of tired people on their way home from work who needed someone to recommend the right cut for a Wednesday and mean it. She had learned the arithmetic of margins so thin they were almost philosophical, and the specific and persistent anxiety of a cash flow that required everything to go right every week, not most weeks, every week. She was 33 years old, and every year of it lived in her body, in the density of her forearms, in the way she moved around the shop without wasted motion, in the steadiness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was actually something else, something closer to the stillness of a person who has learned not to spend energy on things that cannot be changed. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. She was wide-shouldered and full-hipped and physically solid in the way of someone who genuinely worked for a living, who hauled ice crates and lifted hanging carcasses and stood on concrete from 4 in the morning until 6 at night without sitting down. She wore her dark hair pinned back because it stayed out of the way. She wore a canvas apron because it kept the blood off. She had curves that other women paid surgeons to approximate, and a physical presence that entered rooms before she did, like a particular quality of light or a shift in the air's pressure. She was not the kind of woman that men like Dante Ferrara noticed. She had been not noticed for 33 years, deliberately and as a matter of other people's habit, and she had made her peace with it in the way you make peace with a chronic condition. Not by curing it, but by refusing to let it be the most interesting thing about her. There were days this worked well. There were Tuesdays in November, when fog swallowed the city and certain men arrived without warning, when it did not work at all. The Ferrara family had held the distribution contracts for the South Quarter for going on 2 decades. Kora's father had paid tribute on time, in full, without fail, every month, without complaint, because he was a practical man who understood the ecosystem he was operating inside and had made a clear-eyed decision to operate within its rules rather than contest them. He had explained this to Kora when she was 17 and working her first summer in the shop, standing at the sink washing down the cutting boards at the end of the day while he spoke to her carefully and seriously about how the city worked, which arrangements were wiser to honor than to challenge, and which category of men existed in a zone where the correct response was management rather than engagement. She had inherited his pragmatism along with everything else: the shop, the ledgers, the equipment with its complicated maintenance schedules, the debt with its uncomplicated interest rate, and the monthly arrangement with its requirement of punctuality. She paid on time, in full, every month. What she had not inherited was her father's capacity for invisibility in the execution of this. He had been a background person, the kind of man that other men moved through the way they moved through a corridor. Present, acknowledged briefly, then forgotten. Kora was not a background person. Despite every effort, despite the apron and the pinned hair and the professional neutrality she maintained through considerable daily work, she filled rooms in ways she could not seem to control, or diminish, or make less present. And the men who came to collect, month after month in their rotation, had decided that the correct way to handle a woman who insisted on filling rooms was to remind her, consistently and with great creativity, that filling rooms was a liability she ought to be managing more carefully. They had many methods. They helped themselves to product without asking and without gloves. They left fingerprints on the display case glass. They made comments about her body and her size and her situation with the calm authority of men who had never once been on the receiving end of their own methods and therefore had no framework for understanding what such things accumulated into, compounded monthly, over 11 years. She bore it every time with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. She burned for the rest of the day, precisely and without expression, every single time. 11 years. She had done the math once, late at night, past the point where she should have been doing anything involving numbers. She had stopped the calculation before she arrived at the total. Some numbers, she had decided, were not useful to know with that kind of precision. There was a cost to knowing, and she had chosen, deliberately and for her own preservation, not to pay it. She had not expected Dante himself to come. In 11 years, it had never been Dante. It was always intermediaries, men 2 or 3 layers removed from the center, sent to perform the routine of collection without requiring the involvement of anyone important enough to be inconvenienced by it. But the black Mercedes that double-parked outside at 2 in the afternoon on this particular Tuesday was not a collection car. The plates were wrong. The way it stopped was wrong, too precisely, too completely, as if the driver had pre-calculated exactly where he intended the vehicle to be and placed it there with the certainty of a man who had never once had to ask anyone to move. The 2 men who came in first were not the usual collectors. They moved with a compressed, contained quality, scanning the room with the efficiency of men whose professional vocabulary consisted entirely of sightlines, coverages, and exit angles. They positioned themselves at the corners of the shop in a way that had nothing to do with browsing and everything to do with watching every approach simultaneously. Their stillness, the particular stillness of men who were paid to be ready at all times and had been ready so long that readiness was simply their resting state. Security weight, and not the ornamental kind, which meant the man who walked in third, adjusting the cuffs of a charcoal suit that had been constructed for his specific body by someone who charged accordingly for the privilege, was someone whose presence here represented a meaningful departure from routine. He was somewhere north of 40 and carried every year of it with the settled authority of a man who had been the most dangerous person in every room he had entered for going on 2 decades and had long since made his peace with that fact. Dark eyes that swept the shop with the efficiency of a camera on a slow, deliberate pan. Inventory, exits, staff, product, sightlines, the person behind the counter. A jaw that looked carved from a decision already made. He stood in the center of her shop and assessed it the way a man evaluates a property he is considering absorbing, not with enthusiasm, but with the patient attention of someone for whom the conclusion was already determined, and the inspection was simply due diligence. And then his gaze arrived at Kora. He tilted his head at a barely perceptible angle. She knew that angle. She had seen it her entire adult life and could identify it in the time it took other people to notice it was happening. It was the angle of a man computing how little this situation was going to require of him. "You are Bellini's daughter," he said. Low voice, perfectly even, the kind that had never needed volume because the room had always done the work of quieting itself around it. He held the pause after her name for precisely as long as was most useful, and then said, "I expected someone less." Another pause, deliberate. He was too controlled to be careless with pauses. They were instruments. Substantial. The word landed exactly as he intended it to. The man to his left produced the short, confident laugh of someone who had spent years learning exactly when that laugh was expected of him. The one near the display case pressed 2 fingers to the glass with a proprietary ease that suggested the concept of other people's property was something he had theoretically encountered but found largely inapplicable to himself. Kora set down the cleaver. She set it down slowly, blade flat on the board, handle toward herself, the way her father had drilled into her from her first week behind the counter. You always know where the handle is. You always know exactly how many seconds it takes to get back to it. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Dante Ferrara with the complete neutrality of a woman who has been running a calculation for the past several seconds and has arrived at her answer. The delivery surcharge increases 12% when your men handle the merchandise without gloves, she said. Her voice was as level as his. Possibly more so, because her level cost her something, and his was simply his default. That is not a negotiation. It is a health code. He almost smiled. The expression was not friendly. It was the expression of a man who finds unexpected resistance moderately entertaining. The way a man holding an unbeatable hand finds a bluff moderately entertaining, because the outcome is not actually in question, and the small drama before the inevitable conclusion is simply something to occupy the interval. He made a gesture toward the larger of the 2 men. Small, economical, the kind that communicates a full set of instructions in under a second. Handle this. Make a point. Keep it clean. Do not make a mess of her floor. The man's name was Basso. She learned this afterward. He was 6'3" and 240 pounds, and had been doing this work for 8 years without encountering a situation that could not be resolved through the straightforward application of his size and the fact of his presence. He came around the counter with the unhurried confidence of a man for whom the outcome of situations like this had never once been in doubt. He reached for her arm. It was the reaching that was the mistake, not the intent. The geometry of how he reached, elbow elevated and wide, weight fully committed forward onto the front foot, grip telegraphed 3 clear beats before contact could be established. Kora had been reading men moving toward her in confined spaces since she was 15 years old. Her father had required it. He had grown up in a neighborhood that made this one look like a resort, and he held with absolute conviction the belief that the most critical skill a woman in this city could possess was the ability to read a body before it made contact with hers. He had paid for the lessons personally, every week for 4 years, in a studio above a dry cleaner on Calvino Street, run by an instructor who stood 4'11" and had the disposition of a chess player who had already mapped the next 12 moves and was waiting with perfect patience for the board to catch up. Kora had paid attention. For 18 years she had paid attention, every week, in that studio, and then in this shop, and everywhere else her body had ever occupied space, because her father had taught her that the body that knows what is coming has already won half the argument before a hand is raised. She did not step back. Stepping back was what Basso expected. She stepped into him, inside the arc of the reach, close enough that the mechanics of the grab collapsed into uselessness, and her left hand redirected his extended forearm across his own centerline, while her right hip drove through the pivot with the full accumulated force of her body. All of it. Every pound that Dante Ferrara had just summarized in one word, channeled into the geometry of the throw, into the leverage point at the elbow, into the rotation that her instructor had made her practice until it stopped being a technique and became simply what her body did when someone reached for her in a space this size. Basso went down, not stumbled, not staggered, down, hard, flat on his back on the tile floor, with the involuntary and very specific sound a large man makes when the floor arrives substantially faster than his nervous system had been prepared for, and every bit of air exits his lungs simultaneously, and there is nothing at all to be done about it. Kora's knee found his throat before he had finished processing the first beat of the sequence of events that had produced this result. The cleaver was in her right hand. She did not recall picking it up. She did not look at Basso. She looked at Dante Ferrara, and she held his eyes across the counter, and she said, with the complete calm of a woman who is done being furniture, "Weight is leverage. Your man relied on reach. I relied on geometry. This is my kitchen, Signore Ferrara. In a kitchen, geometry always wins." 3 seconds. The fog pressed gray and absolute against the windows. The refrigeration units hummed their single low continuous note. The second bodyguard had his hand inside his jacket and had not moved it any further, because Kora's gaze had found him for exactly 1 beat. The duration of a single slow exhale. And whatever information that beat contained, he had received and processed it correctly, and decided that the inside of his jacket was where his hand was going to remain for the foreseeable future. Dante Ferrara stood exactly where he had been standing since he walked through the door. His expression had not changed, or rather it had changed in a way that was technically imperceptible to anyone not paying the precise, concentrated, almost forensic quality of attention that Kora was currently paying to his face. The quality of attention of a woman who has just put a large man on the floor of her own shop and is now calculating, with considerable care, what happens in the next 30 seconds and the 60 after that. She lifted her knee from Basso's throat. She did not offer him assistance. She stepped back to her side of the counter with the unhurried authority of a woman returning to work she had been briefly interrupted from. Set the cleaver back on the board in its position, blade flat, handle toward herself, and she looked at Dante. "I have 14 other clients on this block," she said. "Not one of them sends men who leave fingerprints on my glass without gloves. I am not a collection problem. I am a distribution asset. That distinction was clear to my father. I am curious whether it is clear to you." She told him she had numbers if he wanted to sit down. The folder had existed for 3 months. She had built it over 4 consecutive evenings at her kitchen table, late after the count, with a glass of wine on her left and her laptop on her right, assembling a block-level analysis of per-unit distribution margins, spoilage rates, comparative contract values, and a forward projection, showing with considerable clarity what happened to a distribution arrangement when three anchor clients on the same block closed within the same calendar quarter. She had assembled it because the previous rate conversation had gone badly, and she had driven home that evening with her hands very tight on the steering wheel and decided that if another rate conversation was coming, she was going to be the person who arrived prepared. She had not planned to use it today. She was very glad she had it. Dante Ferrara sat down. She had not entirely expected that. She retrieved the folder from the back office and set it in front of him, and he opened it and read it. Actually read it, page by page, with the focused silence of a man who had not survived this long by being careless with numbers. And when he reached the last page, he turned it face down on the table and looked at her across the worn wood surface for a moment that extended several beats past the length that most moments reach. 5%, he said. Beginning April. The review timeline holds. She nodded once, extended her hand. After a pause that lasted somewhat longer than handshakes typically require to initiate, he took it. Dry, warm, and completely certain of itself. She felt it take inventory of her the way his eyes had been doing since he walked through her door, but differently now. Not the dismissal of the first 3 seconds, not the entertainment of someone watching a situation he expected to resolve in his favor, but the careful attention of a man recalibrating around new information that he was not going to make the mistake of underweighting. She held his gaze and did not look away, because her instructor had told her at 15 that you never look down first, and she had found no reason in 18 years to revise that particular instruction. He came back on Thursday. No Mercedes, a car she did not recognize, parked 2 streets over, no men, no apparatus of arrival, none of the machinery that usually preceded him into a space. He came in at the end of her day when she was finishing the last count of the close, moving through the familiar arithmetic with the focused efficiency of 11 years of doing the same task, the same way, in the same sequence. He stood on the customer's side of the counter and asked, without any preamble whatsoever, whether she had eaten dinner. She told him she was generally too tired for dinner by the time the count was finished. He said that was a significant structural problem with her schedule. Something about the word structural, applied to dinner in that voice, nearly produced a laugh before she could intercept it. She stopped it just at the threshold, but he heard the almost, and something in his face did something subtle and private and deliberate that she filed away to examine later when she was not actively in the middle of a count. He bought a kilo of guanciale and a half kilo of lardo and paid without looking at the price, which told her something specific and useful about him. A man who cooked seriously, or whose household did. A man for whom the quality of product was a given rather than a decision. She wrapped the package herself, as she always did, with brown paper and the same care she brought to every single thing in this shop, because the care was the whole point, had always been the whole point, and she was not going to stop now simply because the customer watching happened to be who he was. Then he said, without making it an event, that if she happened to have another efficiency argument documented somewhere, he was positioned to address the situation with the 3 neighboring clients she had raised on Tuesday. She looked at him. She thought about the fact that he had retained with precision the specific detail of 3 clients from a conversation that had taken place during what could reasonably be characterized as an escalating situation involving at least one person on the floor. She thought about the fact that he was here on a Thursday evening without any of the men or machinery that usually accompanied his presence in a place. She thought about the guanciale and what a person's choices reveal about them when they are not performing for an audience. I have the folder, she said. I always have the folder. He said, I thought you might, and turned the brown paper package over once in his hands, the way he seemed to handle everything, with the same unhurried precision, as if every object in the world merited being held correctly. And then quietly, in the register he seemed to reserve for things he had been turning over in his mind for several days, without landing, he said, You are the only person who has put Basso on the floor without a weapon in 8 years. He is going to be grateful to you for the rest of his life, even if he cannot yet articulate the precise nature of why. A pause. The refrigerators hummed. The fog had not lifted. I find myself in a somewhat similar position. She was standing behind her counter in her canvas apron, with her hair pinned back and her hands cold from the clothes. And Dante Ferrara was looking at her with a particular quality of attention she had not received once in 33 years from anyone, like she was the most interesting problem he had encountered in a very long time, and he was in no hurry at all to reach the end of it, because reaching the end was not the part that interested him. She thought about 11 years of burning. She thought about every Tuesday visit, every comment, every fingerprint on the glass, every month of being reminded in 100 small, calibrated ways that her body was something she owed an apology for, simply by occupying it. She thought about her father at the sink, explaining ecosystems, telling her that weight was leverage, that geometry always won, that the body was not an obstacle to power but an engine of it, provided you learned the mechanics. She untied the apron strings. She laid the apron on the counter. "The folder is in the back office," she said. "Coffee while you look at it?" He said yes. He said it the way a man says something he has been waiting 2 days for the right moment to say. She turned and walked through the door to the back office, and he followed her into the back of the shop that was simultaneously her father, her grief, her inheritance, her cage, and her kingdom, all of it at once and all of it entirely hers. And behind them, the fog pressed dense and permanent against the windows of Via Moretti, and the city continued its enormous indifferent business, full of men who were completely certain they had already seen everything worth fearing. The underworld did not yet know what had shifted in a butcher shop on the corner of Via Moretti and 9th on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when a woman with a cleaver and a folder and 33 years of accumulated refusal stepped into a reach instead of stepping back. It would find out. These things always announce themselves eventually. Kora Bellini had been making herself impossible to look past her entire life. She was only just getting started, and the city had absolutely no idea what was coming for it. And there she is, Kora Bellini, the woman who showed up to the most dangerous negotiation of her life with a canvas apron, a bone cleaver, and 3 months of block-level margin analysis, and walked away with a 5% rate hold and the undivided and permanent attention of the most feared man in the South Quarter. If this story hit you somewhere real, you already know exactly what the like button is for. Go ahead and press it, because Kora absolutely earned it. And honestly, so did you for writing every single word of this all the way to the very end. Share this with everyone in your life who has ever been underestimated, looked through, written off as too much, or told in 100 subtle and not so subtle ways that taking up space was something requiring an ongoing apology. This one was made specifically for them, and they need to see it. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you are there the moment the next story drops, because we are nowhere near done, and what is coming is going to land even harder than this one did. Every story we tell here is about someone the world tried to make small and failed completely. Kora is proof of what happens when you stop apologizing and start showing up with the folder. And I absolutely need to know in the comments, what was your moment? Was it the 3 seconds? Was it the folder? Was it the guanciale on a Thursday evening with no entourage, no performance, no apparatus? Just a man who came back alone to buy cured pork and tell her, in his particular elliptical way, that she had surprised him completely, and he intended to think about that for a very long time. Drop it below. I read every single one, and the conversation in the comments is always the very best part of the whole thing.